Started. Thanks everyone for being here. I am Olivia Gunn. I'm Associate Professor of Scandinavian Studies at the University of Washington and the current president of SASS. And I have the pleasure today of moderating this book talk. So I'm going to introduce our speaker, and then we have a series of questions. We'll get to hear a couple of readings from the book. And then we will take questions at the end. There's the chat function, so you can put your questions there if you'd like. I will check those out. Or when we're done with the book talk portion, you can also, of course, raise your hand and just let us know what your questions are. So yes, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Dr. Liina-Ly Roos is an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic. And today we have the pleasure of learning about her recent book. Got it right here. The Not Quite Child, Colonial Histories, Racialization, and Swedish Exceptionalism. And this was published by University of Washington Press very, very recently. It's got the date of 2025, a year we're still in. The Not Quite Child examines 21st century cultural texts that incorporate a child figure who disrupts and rethinks the idealized and normative idea of Swedish childhood in order to rethink colonial histories and racial hierarchies in Sweden. So I'm very excited to be able to learn more about this book and discuss it with Dr. Roos. And we thought we would begin just with a very broad question. Tell us the story of your book. So what would you like to share about the process of writing and revising that went into bringing this book into being?
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you for this introduction and for inviting me to talk about my book today. And thank you, everyone who is here. I'm really excited after many years of working on this project to share with all of you, many of whom are dear friends and colleagues. And I'm just excited to celebrate this book by talking about it with you today. And also thank you to SASS for the book subvention as well, and for giving me this space here to talk about it. So like many of our first books in the academic book writing, my book is inspired by my dissertation that I wrote at University of Washington in Seattle. But this book is basically completely rewritten. So I'll just say about the dissertation that I was already then really interested in childhood and what it means for cultural narratives, for literature, for films, what it means to represent childhood or to use child figures to talk about difficult histories or memories. But in my dissertation, the material I worked with was quite broad. It was from Sweden, Finland, and Estonia and Latvia. So it was a more comparative, broader discussion of figures of childhood. And in that work, I was really interested in how child figures were used to talk about memories, specifically World War II memories or some migration memories. And as I was working on my dissertation, though, I became really interested in two things that I think kind of continue in my book. And those are how different dominant and non-dominant narratives in culture have understood the child and what the child has meant for the nation, for example. The future of the nation is often seen through the child, and what that then means for children or people who don't feel like they completely belong in the nation, and do they get to represent the future or not? This was a question that I was asking myself. And the other one that was interesting for me was a proximity of cultures or groups to each other. And by this, I mean like Finnish migrants to Sweden. Sweden and Finland share a long cultural history. Some people would call it a semi-colonial history. That's a controversial term. But in any case, there has been this power dynamic between the two countries where Finnish migrants to Sweden often experienced specifically racialized stereotypes, for example, during the 20th century. So I was really interested in what it means to move between really close borders, proximate borders of cultures and countries, and what that means for the identity of migrants or minorities, But when I started working on this book specifically, so those were the two questions that remained, but I wanted to focus it a little bit more and really think more about the Swedish cultural context. So all the works, both novels and films that I discussed in this book are written or produced in Sweden, and they're all dealing with three national minority groups in Sweden. And the childhood part that was so interesting for me as I was working on this broader material, and I kept thinking and reading and watching films, I just noticed that the child figure kind of pops up in many of these recent works that deal with these histories. And so I thought more about, I read much more about how the child has been understood in the rhetoric of the Swedish welfare state specifically. And there has been a lot of scholarship on sort of more sociological side on how the child has been understood by politicians or people working in education, childhood rights, and things like that in Sweden, and how in the welfare state rhetoric, the child has been symbolically really important. So I read about that a lot as I was revising and working on this book, and it helped me to really understand that the child has had such a unique status and symbolic meaning in Swedish culture. So then it became even more interesting to me than why many of these recent works about the histories of national minorities in Sweden choose to use the figure of the child to talk about what it means to not quite belong or not, or sometimes be excluded or experience racialization. So that's very broad answer to the question how I got started with this book. And then I'd like to say something that my colleagues have said here in the book talk format before, which is that when I was a graduate student, I didn't have so many people read my work and give feedback to it. But as I started as an assistant professor here in Madison, I really found the value in having a writing group and having people regularly give feedback on my writing. And I feel like that was extremely valuable to how or where my book is now and where my writing is now. And I really would encourage anybody who is, if any grad students are listening to this, to make sure that you share your writing with others and get a lot of feedback on it. English is not my first language, so it took me a while, I think, to find my academic voice. But I think as I have been writing this book, I think I found it, at least found some of my academic voice that I am actually happy with. So I think that a community of writing group and colleagues' feedback has been really helpful and good. Yeah.
Super interesting. So you talked a lot about child studies there, and your book is about the child, but a specific version of the child. Maybe not the capital T, capital C child from some work in child studies, but the not quite child specifically. So I thought it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about this figure, and it's kind of a two-part question that I have for you. First, what is not quiteness? Maybe generally speaking, where did that concept come from, and how does it play out in your book, maybe differently? And then the second part of the question is that you focus on Swedish national culture, broadly speaking, which is something you were just talking about, and then focus in for this book on three national minorities. So I'd like to hear also a little bit about why you selected these minoritized groups and how not quiteness applies to them. And is it the same kind of not quiteness for all three groups because it's coming from sort of Swedish national perspectives, or are there key differences for these groups?
Mhm. Thank you for this question, this two-part question. Yes, so the not quiteness is a term I have thought about a lot, both with this book and with some other articles I've been working on as well, dealing all with um, national minorities in Sweden and also with Eastern Europeans and their representations in culture and media. That's part of my work as well that I don't talk about in this book, so I won't go into it right now much more. But anyway, when I have been working with this material in the Nordic region, stories of, let's say, indigenous Sami people in Swedish literature or the Finnish labor migrants in Sweden, something that is that was similar to many of these experiences and how people in these fictional works expressed these experiences has been that people feel that they are almost part of the Swedish nation or the Swedish collective, but not quite. And this not quiteness is that while they look usually like white Swedes, so they're not necessarily seen as people of color, they nevertheless feel like they're not quite part of this white Swedishness. And as I was reading these stories, I read, of course, a lot of scholarship, both in and outside of the Nordic or Scandinavian studies that has to do with race, racialization, whiteness, postcolonial theory or decolonial theory. Uh, um, and in a lot of that, what scholars in the Nordic context obviously have brought out is that there has been this rhetoric of color blindness, right, or racial innocence in the Scandinavian region, where people haven't really talked about race or racialization as much, at least when it comes to talking about the Nordic societies themselves. And there's a lot of recent really good scholarship that resists that and shows that there is, in fact, a lot of racism and a lot of racialization in the Nordic context. So I was interested in all of that, but then I was interested in these stories that talk about people who pass as white, especially in contemporary societies, but that have felt this historical racialization, which goes back to late 19th and early 20th century, when all of these groups that I talk about in the book, the Finnish speakers, Tornedalians, and indigenous Sami people were hierarchized and categorized as lower race than the white Nordic race. And of course, that has been debunked now, but the impact of this racialization and categorization and hierarchies of different whitenesses has an impact and has had an impact throughout the 20th century and the 21st century. And so the specific term not quiteness, it's been helpful for me to read Rosi Braidotti and some other scholars who have looked at Eastern Europeans. I'll mention that once more here. Eastern Europeans and their kind of representation and self-identity in the broader context of Europe. And Rosi Braidotti uses Homi Bhabha's famous phrase, almost the same but not quite white, which is about the non-white colonial subject who can mimic or know a lot about the colonizer and almost be the same as the colonizer, but never quite because they're not white. And Rosi Braidotti writes about that and says Eastern Europeans can pass as white, but have also been seen in this broader European context as not quite part of the European inner self because they're racialized as not quite there because they have had a different history because of occupations, colonization, and have oftentimes in stereotypical rhetoric seen as not quite as civilized, not quite as white. And so ultimately, what scholars in the Nordic region like Suvi Keskinen or Tobias Hübinette, who talk about whiteness and colonial histories, have said that in Europe in general and in Scandinavia too, whiteness and Westernness are still seen as whiteness equals Westernness, whiteness equals Nordicness. And this is why a lot of non-white people in Scandinavia feel that they cannot belong and are often excluded. And this is then also why many of these historical minorities in Sweden have felt that they're not quite white, but they can pass as white. So there's a privilege there of being able to pass, but also a sense of this experience of not being included as almost invisible because you can't really see that on one's body, but one can nevertheless feel that. So that is what I mean by Nordic not quiteness, almost part of the white Swedish nation or the Nordic nations, but not quite. And then I was interested in how these stories are trying to navigate what that means, what that experience means, and how to even represent that, what it means to represent that if you can't really see difference, but you can feel difference. And then the second question about if this not quiteness, or first these national minorities, and if the not quiteness is similarly experienced by them. And one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on these three groups in this book is because, as I said, I was reading a lot of novels and watching films that dealt with broadly these large questions. And I noticed that after the year 2000, there was an increase in films and novels that were dealing with these histories, specifically the three national minority groups, Sweden Finns, Tornedalians, and indigenous Sami people. And while Roma and Jewish people are also part of the five national minority groups in Sweden, it just seemed that there was an increase in these three groups specifically, and how they dealt with this sort of invisible history of racialization and inferiority and not belonging. And then also, all of these three groups are Finno-Ugric groups. So their languages and cultures are in some ways have some similarities, but they also have some very crucial differences, which I make sure to talk about in the book in various places too. So my goal with this book is not to just say all these three groups are the same or they share the same kind of history. What they share is a varying extent of colonial relationship to the Swedish nation state, and a long shared cultural history, the proximity, right, too. But at the same time, the indigenous Sami people continue to have a colonial relationship with Sweden and have a little different history than, for example, Finnish speakers in Sweden today. But all of these groups in the early 20th century were seen as inferior to the white Nordic race, but only a little inferior, right? And then both indigenous Sami people and Tornedalians living in the northern areas of Sweden were subject to a lot of racial violence, skull measuring, and things like that that were shared by these communities often. But then also the Tornedalian people were expected usually to assimilate into Swedishness, which was also traumatic and troubling. It often meant that they had to sort of forget the language and from early age to completely be assimilated into Swedishness, while many Sami people, especially in the northern areas of the Sapmi lands, were supposed to be segregated from Swedishness. So that's a crucial historical difference there. And then Finnish labor migrants coming to Sweden in the 60s and 70s, of course, too, have a different history, but were faced with stereotypes during those decades in Sweden that were similar or were drawing from this broader Finno-Ugric groups that were seen as not as civilized, as closer to nature, as not quite as Nordic, white, Swedish as they should be or were expected to be. So that is what is shared, but then there are also hierarchizations between these three groups and even within these groups. So it's a complex history. And something else I mentioned in the book is that oftentimes for the Sami communities, it's not so important to focus on the national borders. It's not about just the Swedish Sami or the Norwegian Sami. But in this book, I focus on the Swedish side of Sami together with these other two minority groups because I'm interested in how these texts that I work with navigate the dynamics between what it means to belong or not belong to these national minority groups and how that relates to the common or dominant rhetoric in Sweden when it comes to childhood, when it comes to whiteness, when it comes to the welfare state.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And, one thing that you talk about in the book that is also interesting that maybe we won't have time to talk so much about, but it can serve as a bridge, I think, in some ways to the next question that I have is passing. Like what are the dynamics of passing? How exactly does it work in this context? So maybe that can be integrated a little bit in your answer to the next question, which is about another key figure in your book, lining up.
Mm-hmm.
So I was curious how other scholars have talked about this concept. How does it show up differently in the films and novels that you analyze? And that's another interesting thing about the book is that many of your arguments are about formal cinematic or literary aspects of these works. So how does lining up show up in these works, like both formally and in terms of, the thematic content? And then what is the difference between lining up with whiteness, which is, I know, one way in which that's been figured, and lining up to measure the distance from whiteness?
Mhm. Yes, and I'll do a reading here first,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So so we thought that I would start by answering this question with a short reading from the conclusion, from the beginning of the conclusion of this book. So it's about 1.5 pages. So I'll just read that. It gives you an example of one of the films I discuss in the book, and then also kind of leads into the one of the arguments I make in the book, and then I'll come back to this question that Olivia asked. Okay, so consider this scene from Sami Blood, which is a film by Amanda Chernell. After having left her home in Sapmi, where she was forced into a life segregated from Swedish society, and trying to fulfill her dream of becoming a teacher by pretending not to be Sami in the 1930s, Ella Maria has been able to enroll at a girls' school in Uppsala and is entering a room to attend her first gymnastics class. The class has already started, and the girls are lined up in straight rows. The metronome is ticking, and the teacher gestures at Ella Maria to find a spot among her peers. The camera follows her as she cautiously makes her way, and we see the teacher set the metronome to a slightly slower pace. Once the girls start moving in nearly perfect synchrony, Ella Maria is not able to keep up with the movements. She misses most of them, and each of her motions that is off the beat or behind the rhythm emphasizes her difference from others. Wearing the same clothes as the girls in the class, Ella Maria looks like them, but as the film audience knows, she has had to burn her gakti and adopt a new identity in order to be allowed to enter the classroom at all. As the scene goes on, she is able to imitate many of the movements, but is still lagging a bit behind the rhythm of the metronome. In Sami Blood, this scene visualizes the experiences of many indigenous Sami people in Sweden during the 20th century. While able to pass as white Swedes, the only way for many of them to not be excluded from the Swedish society was to erase their indigenous heritage and line up with white Swedishness. And this alignment often happened in one's youth or childhood. It is also telling that the film uses the girls' gymnastics class to visualize Ella Maria's failed attempts at passing and moving in synchrony. As Johannes Westberg has already demonstrated in analyzing the educationalization of gymnastics in Sweden in the 19th century, the purpose of gymnastics was to foster national citizens that could support a strong Swedish nation, and women or girls were then seen as fundamental to the nationalist project. Throughout this scene, Ella Maria is shown being unable to keep up with the movements that were so instrumental in the fostering of Swedish citizens. This scene is emblematic of the argument I have made in The Not Quite Child, that a recurring figure in several 21st century cultural texts from Sweden is a child who disrupts, rethinks, and re-embodies the expected trajectory of growing up as the Swedish child, and in doing so, makes visible the implications of historical racialization and colonial histories in Sweden. Ella Maria navigates the position of a not quite child. The 21st century films and novels I have analyzed in this book navigate what it means to visualize historical racialization, becoming, feelings of lagging behind, passing, assimilation, and erasure of cultures. They imagine possible or impossible alternatives to growing up and becoming, or growing sideways on a normative trajectory. As they do so, these texts incorporate the figure of what I have called the not quite child, a child who is legible as a white Swede, but at the same time, because of racialization and colonial histories, is made to feel that they are not quite Swedish or white. My analyses have demonstrated how different films and novels use formal elements from a variety of genres and modes, such as melodrama, magical realism, or parody, to challenge the expectations for not only the idealized child figure in Swedish culture, but also for its representational power in cinematic and literary works. So, yeah, so now to come back to the lining up, the concept of lining up, it's something that I specifically appreciated how Sara Ahmed has written about in her work in the phenomenology of whiteness and queer phenomenology. And there she writes about lining up and thinking about like this bodily or spatial experience and feeling of the dominance of whiteness in the society around one. In many contexts and societies that she writes about, lining up functions sort of as a straightening device where when bodies line up with the normative expectations and with white bodies, then they sort of like disappear into the sea of whiteness, as she calls it. And it is and then those who don't line up or stand out of the line feel not included, not belonging, and not part of this expected trajectory. And as you can already tell from what I just said, the way that she explains these experiences is very spatial and thinking a lot about what it actually feels in the space around one. And so this was helpful for me as I was thinking about what it means to pass as a white Swede when one is white, but feels and is always told that one is not quite part of this white Swedish nation. Um, and so some examples in the films that I work with in Elina, As If I Wasn't There, and in Sami Blood, there are these literal visual examples of the children who are made to line up in the schools, or as they're walking through the villages, or as they're meeting the racial scientists from Uppsala who come to the Sápmi areas. And they are lined up there in this perfect straight line. And as they're doing that, the interactions they have with various people around them, they are constantly told that they are not part of the Swedish nation and they're not as smart, they're not as civilized, they're not as white, one could say, even though that word is never directly used. But so I was interested in how these films, for example, are trying to show what it means to be expected on one hand to line up with this white line of whiteness, the line of normative Swedishness, and at the same time being told that it's impossible to do that. So what does it mean to navigate this space of impossibility, and how these works are using the child figure to visualize that. So I used the word visualize here several times, which in my analysis of the films has been interesting then to see how camera angles and lighting are used to show these children lining up, and then maybe in shadows or different camera angles are showing that they're not really actually part of this normative white space that they're supposed to be. But the concept of lining up is something that shows up in all of my chapters, as also the literary child figures are bringing examples of, again, people around them telling them that they are not going to be as successful or as good Swedish citizens because there's something inherently wrong with them, even though it's not visible, or they can't really always explain what is wrong with them. But then as they go further in their lives and hear more commentary about them, or hear how their parents or their neighbors are experiencing their lives in Sweden, they realize it's because of this Finnishness in their body, or the Tornedalian identity or heritage, or the Sami heritage that makes it impossible to pass, while they, visibly speaking, could easily pass. Yeah.
Yeah. In your analysis of Sameblo, you talk also a lot about the sort of gaze of the child.
Mhm.
So, in addition to how the children are lined up, or how we might see them kind of looking at them in
Mhm.
these lines, or
Mhm.
maybe the way the camera both aligns and disaligns with the gaze of the racial biologist, or not. So I think that that's an interesting transition because, for example, the character of Ella Maria,
Mhm.
Like, how much does her looking matter for her own agency
Mhm.
in stepping out of one line in order to potentially step into line in another way, kind of leads me to another question,
Mhm.
which is about Pippi feminisma.
Mhm.
And this is also a kind of a two-parter. And I guess I'm associating now Ella Maria's gaze with a kind of agent's sort of active gaze that we might also potentially associate with Pippi feminisma. But so what is that? What does it have to do with the book?
Uh-huh.
Um, I think maybe you could use it to talk a little bit more about who the exceptional Swedish child is and
Mhm.
exactly how that differs from a child like Ella Maria, even though she
Mhm.
also is a rebel,
Mhm.
right? And an agent and a fascinating figure who fights for what exactly it is that she thinks she wants.
Mhm.
And of course, there are losses when you have those kind of gains as well.
Mhm.
And I guess as a second part to that question, another big two-parter, but um, a second part of that is like, how does this book fit into not just child studies, but girl studies? You mentioned kind of at the end of the book that hadn't really been an intention, but that you could see how it fits also into girl studies.
Mhm.
Yeah, so both talking a little bit about Pippi Feminisma and its fit and bad fit, and
Mhm.
then also child studies and girl studies and where exactly you kind of intervene there.
Yeah, thank you for that.
And I think you were going to do maybe another reading as well here.
Yes, yeah, maybe I'll answer a little bit and then I'll do another reading. Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, Pippifeminism is a term that scholars Elina Oinas and Anna Kollander have used. And there's a few other kind of similar ways that the phenomenon of Pippi and the impact of her has been talked about that I discuss in both the introduction and the conclusion. So the way that they specifically talk about Pippi feminism is this phenomenon of seeing Pippi Longstocking, and many of you here know Pippi Longstocking and can see why she has been an inspirational figure in various ways. And what they are doing is they are actually looking at how this relates to girl studies question too. Actually, they're looking at how groups of girls, specifically in Finland and Sweden, feel that they want to emulate what Pippi represents, which is independence, competence, fighting against injustice, having this agency that you just talked about, which are all good things. But sometimes what has happened with seeing Pippi as this inspirational figure is that in the rhetoric around it, people often have felt that as long as one just themselves works hard enough, is strong enough, just chooses to be like Pippi, then everything will be good and they can be like Pippi. And what, for example, Oinas and Kolander bring out from their discussions with girls, their study is more sort of sociological study. They're talking to girls living in Finland and Sweden, and they are finding that girls who aren't always able to choose that as easily because of various structural injustices or how they see themselves and are seen in the society, they feel that they can't so easily just say, I'm going to be independent and strong, just like Pippi, because maybe their family doesn't have any money or they face racist commentary or things like that. And so then what does that mean for these girls or children to to be told that as long as they just choose to be like Pippi, everything is fine, but they feel that they cannot do that really. So that excludes many girls or children. And it kind of then relates to some other scholarship that's been done around the symbolic significance of Pippi Longstocking and the Swedish welfare state, like Eva Söderberg or even Henrik Berggren and Lars Tregård in their famous book on the Swedish theory of love, oftentimes have articulated how Pippi Longstocking became the symbol for the welfare state citizen who is taken care of by the welfare state, so doesn't have worries or cares and can in this independent manner go about the world, go about the culture, the country, and stand up for injustices. And so many of these other scholars too, just like the ones talking about Pippi feminism, are saying, but it doesn't always work this way. Not everybody can just choose to be like this. And so what does it mean then to not be included in that Pippi feminism or Pippi phenomenon? And so then some childhood studies scholars in Sweden, like Bengt Sandin, have also talked a lot about how Pippi Longstocking and the child through that figure, as it became this symbolic meaning for the Swedish citizen, also meant that standing against injustice, having this agency to do that, being independent, being competent, became kind of a normative expectation for children or child figures. And so then how does one resist normative expectations when resistance itself is only possible in a certain way, is a question that was really interesting to me. And then what does it mean to perform some of the qualities of Pippi, and for literary or cinematic works to have the child figures do that, but not to fall into this inspirational figure that Pippi often has been, that provides maybe too easy solutions to the readers or the audiences. Again, saying, okay, if this migrant child just works hard enough and chooses the independence that Pippi represents, then it doesn't matter that she faces racism. She can still be a strong and happy child or a happy Swedish citizen. Um, so in Sami Blood, as you asked what that might look like in this film, or with this example that I just read too, there are moments where the child uh, can't really choose this path of resistance in the way that maybe a child figure like Pippi would be able to, because she is constantly told that she cannot resist, or she cannot be like Swedish. She has to be only in a specific way Sami, and she doesn't have the agency to choose to sometimes wear other clothes or to go to school in with Swedish children. And of course, that takes place in the 1930s, but the film is made in 2016. So I think the inspirational child figure idea is part of is definitely there for the audiences watching the film, and for the filmmaker making it. So as I was looking kind of formally what this film is doing with that, or are there any moments of resistance or agency that the child figure still could have? And there was one that I talk about in the book, which is where there's a few scenes throughout the film where Ella Maria, we see a close-up of Ella Maria after some really difficult experiences she has had, and she looks sideways. She doesn't look into the camera. And there's especially one scene that's about 15 seconds long where we don't see anything else. We don't hear what she's talking about. We don't see what she is looking at. Nothing else happens in the scene. We just see her looking away. And I'm arguing with my analysis there that it's one of the ways for the film to resist giving all the answers to the audiences, or giving just a child figure that inspires them, and rather leaves some things unseen or unresolved. And that is one way, sort of formally, for the film to imagine some kind of resistance and agency without necessarily falling into this normative idea of an exceptional Swedish child, or even a minority child in Sweden, that as long as she chooses these good things that Pippi represents, can just forget about the colonization or racial histories, and can simply provide inspiration and a good feeling for the audience. Um, and then I think I've mentioned a little bit about childhood studies already, but I think all these questions in childhood studies that have to do with what does it mean, first of all, for the child to represent a future for the nation or the culture that I mentioned in the beginning, but also what it means for the child figure to feel, or excuse me, for the texts to kind of play with, like, first of all, resisting this idea that there's only one child figure that can represent the future for the whole nation, But then what does it mean for these minority figures to not be allowed to have future at all? So that was interesting to me, thinking about then um, what does Ella Maria in this film, or some of the literary children in the novels that I analyze, how can they still have some sort of agency or choose a path of resistance, but not choose this normative child figure? So I think then, yeah, thinking about how the child has been too often representing future, and but also resisting only that reading too has been helpful for me from childhood studies perspective. And then, as I said in the conclusion, I didn't set out to only look at texts that have girl figures, but it turned out that most of these texts that I work with do have a protagonist who identifies as girl. And I think that it actually connects to this idea of the child representing the future or reproduction for the nation state or culture, in that many of these child and girl figures feel that not only are they supposed to line up with a normative child that represents future for the Swedish welfare state or for their minority group that are seen as distinct and separate, but also because they're supposed to grow up to be women who reproduce these two groups, right? That then they are noticing these gendered expectations that they're faced with when they start getting closer to their teenage years, especially in the novels that I discuss about Tornedalians in northern Sweden and the Finnish-speaking migrants in Sweden in the 60s and 70s. And they feel like only while they're the child still can they choose a sense of like both, and of being both part of the minority group and the Swedish majority group, and they don't necessarily have to line up yet, but they know that as soon as they start growing up and becoming a woman, that's when they're supposed to really fall in line with this normative um, idea or understanding of the future for the nation or for the minority group. Yeah.
Thank you for that. There's so much more that I would like to talk about and ask about, but we do not have time. But I do think you have one more reading planned, a short reading. I
Yes,
think
yeah, that's right.
it would be great to end with that and let the book, in a way, have the last word. And then we will have time for questions.
Yes, thank you. So this one is from the chapter that deals with the Finnish labor migrant families in Sweden. And I'll just read two paragraphs from here. Both Svinalengorna and Ingenbarnsland, which are the two novels I discuss, make explicit references to the idyllic and unreachable image of childhood conveyed in some of the most popular texts in Swedish children's culture, and construct stark contrasts to it in the lives of their child protagonists. One of the passages in Svinalengorna, for example, visualizes the impossibility of lining up with the ideal childhood in a family where the parents struggle with alcoholism and belonging in their new country. The child protagonist lists everything that is going well during a brief period when her parents are sober. But through the subtle hints of impossibility or disillusionment, the narrative suggests that the sober period does not last long or does not even truly exist. The child's list of good things features laughter, homemade food, idyllic family time, a white loaf of bread that rises in the oven, and, quote, is enough for all the world's children, end of quote. And Pippi Longstocking, who has red hair on their black and white TV. Seeing the red color on the black and white TV set, or baking enough bread for all the world's children, makes it apparent that what the child describes seeing is illusory, and furthermore, that the kind of life that Pippi's image promises is not available for her. By connecting this Pippi reference to the hyperbolized image of having enough bread for all the world's children, the novel emphasizes its commentary on a dominant narrative of exceptionalism in the self-image and international reputation of Sweden, as it constructs experiences of people who find themselves excluded from the welfare state and who observe problems within it or within its well-meaning but at times patronizing gestures. Furthermore, it constructs a child figure who experiences her every day as a continuous failure to attain the promises of the Swedish welfare state. Ingen Barnsland, in turn, opens with a passage that similarly alludes to Pippi Longstocking, but it performs a grotesque image of the ideals that Pippi stands for. Namely, the first sentence of the novel describes the child protagonist Mira, quote, beating the shit out of her classmate Lasse, end of quote, who, as we later find out, has bullied some of the other girls in Mira's class. The first paragraph of the novel paints quite a graphic image of the violent outburst of the child whose braids fluttered wildly around as her arms, like small propellers, whip Lasse's head so much that the flesh under his skin is darkened, and Mira imagines her face like rubber expand and tear off from the body, spitting out poisonous snot. Throughout the novel, as Mira fights for justice and resembles Pippi in many ways, Ingen Barnsland depicts her behavior as grotesque and abject and maintains that she, too, also a child of the Finnish labor migrants in Sweden, fails to line up with Swedishness and Swedish childhood. However, in Ingen Barnsland, failure becomes a way to subvert these normative categories. Through constructions of failure and abjection, then these two novels unsettle and reorient the image of Swedish childhood.
Thank you so much. We have time for questions. Yeah, again, I wish we had more time because there's so many more fascinating things to discuss. So I obviously recommend that everyone get the book and read the book. Um, but yeah, thank you so much. I have to have some applause here. And yeah, please, I will pay attention to messages in the chat if you'd like to put your questions there, or just turn on your camera and let us know what your questions are. We'll just continue to wait patiently here. Ah, there's a question in the chat. I'm sorry, I have not seen this. I can't see actually your question in the chat. I don't know why. I see that you have a question, but I do not see the question itself. Maybe you could,
I don't see it either.
yeah. You could repost. Oh, Dean is wondering if this normative Pippi idea is really persistent. Um, is it kind of a straw man at this point, or does it have some kind of continued salience?
That's a good question. I think that it's not as persistent anymore, and the texts that I work with are really working with its prevalent figure or image or remediation in the 60s, 70s, 80s, um, when its impact was so strong, and as these texts are directly referring to it. But I think that in today's media, probably not as much. Some of these, the scholars that I mentioned talking about Pippi feminism and still sensing this like normative idea of what she represents, I think are arguing that it to a certain extent still exists, especially in this rhetoric of getting to choose what one wants to do and getting to choose to be strong. But I think that overall it's not quite as persistent anymore. Yeah.
Is there a way so these novels are 21st century novels. I mean, the reading that you just did, very clearly that's a Pippi. Right? Beating banked up or whatever, putting him in the tree, whatever it is that she does. Um, but is that so clearly it lingers for these authors. So are you suggesting that it matters for them because of these memories of an earlier period, because of the attention to the 60s and 70s, and that's why it matters for them? And that's distinct from it mattering for, media or like contemporary discourse production? Just to
Yeah, I
follow up.
think that some of the goals for these authors is to make visible this history that they have felt as invisible in Swedish culture as a whole. Not that it's been invisible for everyone, of course, but just in this more dominant or larger parts of culture. I would say that that's the main goal of most of these works, is to make this history and the memory more visible, and then also just hashing out what that has meant intergenerationally for the minority groups. Um, and something that I just very briefly mentioned in my conclusion is that it would be interesting to see how the child figure and the not quite child figure develops or changes in the works that deal with 21st century Sweden. And something that, especially actually with all of these three groups, and especially indigenous Sami literature and Tornedalian literature or film, um, is, I think, more interested now in reclaiming this minority identity and not feeling ashamed for not being quite Swedish, and also kind of, I think, finding a way to not having to choose between one or two, or not having to fall in line or pass in this line. So the impossibility to line up with white Swedishness is not the same, is shouldn't be the problem anymore, because one wants to resist that. So I think that the child figures in that sense are also differing. But I think that some of these recent works too are still interested in the impact of this history that's so important for these authors I talk about in this book, and the impact intergenerationally, or like a presence of shame or embarrassment that one can't always even articulate why it's there, is still present and important for some of the authors. Yeah.
I would just like to
Yes.
thank you for an incredibly interesting talk, Liina-Ly. And when it comes to Pippi feminism, I think about my friends who are now becoming grandmothers, and the first book they give their grandchildren, the granddaughters, is the Pippi books and Pippi lunch bags. And so I think that media might not talk much about it, but I think that as a subculture, it is still living on pretty strongly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that your whole discussion on the lining up and the minorities, I think, are very interesting concepts for any minority when it comes to neurodiverse individuals in societies, and I think particularly also in Sweden. So thank you so much. Much to think about.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Brad, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. I apologize for not figuring out how to turn on all the things. And it took me a while to formulate my question, but actually it's rather simple, which was, I'm curious, towards the end of the book, you talk more about plurality and collectivity. And I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about that too, especially as it relates to this, duality of singular and plural.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for this question. Yeah, so this is mostly figures in the third chapter, where I talk about a recent novel by Katarina Gieri called Vårt värde, Our Worth or Our Value. And it's a book that deals with the Tornedalian identity in Sweden. And the form of the novel is really interesting. It's a little more poetic. It doesn't have necessarily a lot of plot. It's just this different kinds of experiences that the narrator is describing. And if we want to say the main child figure, I'll say more about that in a second, is a child who mostly speaks Swedish and has parents and grandparents who have dealt more with this troubling, very violent racialization and stereotyping and violence. But the child now living in the late 70s or so in Sweden feels that it's really easy to pass whichever way they want. They don't really speak the Finnish or Tornedalian language as well, but they feel that they can a little more easily choose what they want to be or who they want to be. But they also deal with what this legacy of this racialization and colonial history means. But on a formal level, the novel makes use of plural first-person narrative a lot, and differently than the other books or novels that I talk about in this book. And it kind of switches back and forth, so it's not just a collective narrator that's always in first person plural. Sometimes it's singular, but it's made clear that the narrator it's not just a group that's narrating, that it is actually one person, but they're oftentimes using the plural voice rather than the singular voice to talk about so they would say things like, our mothers and our fathers went there and did that, and we didn't know what we should do, or we didn't know what our worth was. And in some cases, you could argue they're just talking about the collective, but in many passages, it's very clear that it's something in between. And so something that I discuss or think about then with this form is that many of the things that the narrator is saying there are things like, do I have a post-colonial history or identity or not? Or what does it mean to have some cousins across the border here and across the border there? And what does it mean that the central power long time ago like cut my tongue in half, and now I have these two languages that I have to sometimes choose between? And I engage a little bit with post-colonial studies that have said that this collective narrative or plural narrative has been really popular in many post-colonial, especially recent texts that don't want to only claim a single or singular identity, like either the colonizers or the colonized or anything else, but rather is interested in what it means to live in this hybrid space. But not to have the hybrid identity either be just a singular identity. So the plural voice kind of helps to show or deal with this plural identity that one has. And then as I end my chapter there, I'm thinking about all these other child figures in these novels and films I talk about that do resist the exceptional Swedish child, and what it means to represent that in fictional work. But that this novel with this like plural child figure, plural child narrator, is kind of also resisting the need, or resisting that when you have a one figure of the child that's representing a minority culture, it still becomes the child that represents it, and it resists that singularity, and it wants to kind of unsettle the child figure that has to represent something or some group only, and rather wants to think about what it means to have hybrid identities and live in the mix of it, and not know and have a messy and troubling history, but also have sometimes a fun everyday life, like how to include all these identities together. And one of the ways that this novel, I think, so interestingly does that is through this plural child figure.
Could I ask a follow-up really quick, just as a
Yeah.
technical thing?
Yeah.
I haven't read the book yet. I've been meaning to. But just you talked about the first person. Are there also is there I guess not anything interesting, but like are there also things going on in the second person or the third person even, or is it really focused on this first
Not
person?
really. It's just
Okay.
first person, plural versus first person singular. And sometimes it switches between the two in one passage. So it's very fluid in how it uses those. Yeah. It's a cool book. I hope you read it.
Anybody else feeling brave to turn the camera on or ask a question in the chat? Well, I guess that I will pose my final question, which I wanted to make time for some questions from the audience, but since we have time here and I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, the final question I had was about, and maybe it's related to some of these questions you're getting as well. It was about these 21st century perspectives on representations of recent troubling histories in cinema and literature. And so we talked about not quiteness and we talked about lining up, but other central concepts in the book are impossibility, failure, uh, passing, so visibility and invisibility or the dynamics there, and unsettling. And I kind of had a question about the aim of these works, right? Since they're revisiting troubling history, since sometimes they're maybe trying to do anti-racist work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm wondering like how those things fit together. And I guess this is a massive question about the function of critique in a way. Like what work and some of this comes out in your readings like of the film in the second chapter. What is the title of this film about the Tornedalian girl? Sorry.
Elena, as if I wasn't there. Mm-hmm.
As if I wasn't there, Alina. Yes. So the sort of troubling question of is this giving us a happy ending or is this making more room for critique?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering how these concepts like failure and um, kinds of concepts emerging from maybe anti-racist critique and queer critique matter for the future, which is a troubling concept in child studies,
Mm-hmm.
a concept that's often like resisted or troubled, but
Mm-hmm.
presumably there is some kind of goal in terms of memory work or reconciliation. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a good question. Yeah, I think that, like I said before, the goal for many of these works is to tell stories that the authors feel haven't been told enough or haven't been understood and seen and discussed enough in Swedish culture, and even more broadly than that, maybe. But then I think there are some works in this book that are interested in telling these stories and resisting some of these normative ideas I've talked about before today. And of course, resisting the racist attitudes or discriminatory ideologies and rhetoric in the past Swedish welfare state, but that are also trying to still imagine some kind of a happy ending. Most of these books, I don't think, have necessarily a clear cut happy ending or novels or films. But Elena, as if I wasn't there, is a good example of this is also the only work that I deal with in this book that is made by a filmmaker who doesn't themselves have any minority history or heritage. And again, I didn't choose these authors just because of that they have a heritage or not, but only one of them doesn't. And that one is the one that I think aims to give a little more happy, kind of resolved ending for the Swedish audience. But like I say in my analysis, it uses this melodramatic mode that I don't use in a negative way at all. I think that melodrama has a lot of potential to show what are the happy endings that maybe the majority audience wishes to see, and then suddenly shows that maybe that happy ending is actually impossible. And I won't go into too much detail in how it does that because people can read that in my book. But that's one example of kind of dealing with impossibility or not impossibility. But then in some of my other chapters, I engage with the idea of failure, especially in some of the queer theorizations, like by Jack Halberstam, that has written about how failure could in societies that promote success again in a very normative way, success that means like capital accumulation or heteronormative ideas about family, future, things like that. In those kinds of contexts, failure might mean that you resist those ideas or that you choose an alternative life that is happy in its own way, but it can be understood as failure. It can be understood as choosing failure that has other alternatives. But then I'm discussing a little bit like what that might mean in the Swedish context and how some of these child figures, especially the one that deals with Ingen Barnsland, that deals with a Finnish-speaking child in Sweden who very directly sometimes says that she doesn't want to be part of the winners, and if that means that some people have to lose, or she doesn't want to be successful in this very specific idea of a Swedish grown-up woman. She doesn't want to be that, but she also doesn't want to be always seen as a forever migrant because her parents are Finnish speakers, and she's always expected to just have a job as a cleaner. That's the only thing that she could do, is what people tell her. So I'm interested then in how these texts are like seeing, can failure or choosing failure have this alternative subversive mode for the characters. And I'm in my analysis showing that it does to a certain extent, but these texts are also showing that sometimes failure is disappointing and sad and difficult because of these societal structures around the protagonists, and that it's not always so easy to choose failure as a subversive potential. So I think that overall, then one more answer to what's the broad goal of many of these works, right, as they're doing the anti-racist and anti-discriminatory work, is first to show the memory and the history, but then also to imagine what resistance might look like to these normative lines, and most importantly, I think to imagine a space of like pause and delay on this lining up trajectory, but then often ending up in places that show that it's really quite difficult and almost impossible to resist the line of whiteness, whatever that means for the different protagonists. So many of the endings are not necessarily happy or providing the audience with inspiration or healing, but I think simply by hashing out what it means to inhabit these spaces of impossibility already helps the authors to make these experiences visible, and to also provoke more discussion and conversation among the audiences, whether they're in the dominant majority culture or the minorities themselves.
Unless there are last minute questions from the audience.
Mhm.
Then maybe we could, if there's nothing, I'm just making sure I don't want to miss anybody. I see a lot of comments in the chat about thank you for this excellent talk. And yeah, I think people obviously have to run and do things like teach and so on and so forth. So thank you to everyone who was here, and thank you to those of you who are still here. This was a really nice opportunity to learn more about this book and to celebrate the publication. So congratulations again, Liina-Ly. I have to like get my reaction going here. More clapping. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for everyone for coming, and thanks especially to Liina-Ly for taking this time to share her work with us.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Olivia, for these great questions.